Okay, so to conclude this week's Soccer 1010 content, I'm going to talk about the sociological imagination. So, the sociological imagination is a kind of call to look at the world in a particular way. I mentioned already the kind of sociological gaze that thinks about the relationship between agency and structure. The sociological imagination is a little bit more segmented and has four factors to help us have a sociological imagination. I do want to say before I even start talking about those four factors is it's not really all that necessary to kind of get bogged down in like putting things in the different boxes of the four factors. It's just kind of a more, I suppose, a call to help like think about things in a particular way. So I'll give some examples about different ways of thinking through those four things, but you don't have to kind of think too much about like sticking things in those boxes. It's a way of just thinking about the world. And I'll expand on that a little bit more in a sec. So C. Wright Mills, a very famous and prominent and influential sociologist, was the one who coined the idea of the sociological imagination, this idea of a vivid awareness of the relationship between private experience and wider society. Again, you can hear kind of nods towards agency and structure here. In particular, it helps us think about how public issues, big social problems, must be revealed by relating them to personal troubles, and vice versa. So a kind of good example to think about this is that, if you have a particular illness, you might be on the waiting list to have some kind of surgery. I suppose that's very much a private individual trouble. If you don't get the surgery, you're not going to get better, you could die. But the reason why you might be on that kind of waiting list and why that wait might take a long time is, there mightn't be enough hospital beds, or there might be enough of those kind of surgeons, or there might have been decisions made to fund, research into this kind of cancer over that kind of cancer, and maybe it's harder for you to actually get treatment. So that individual trouble about getting a surgery is definitely an individual issue, but in terms of, thinking about how that could be fixed or how that could be better, it's very likely to relate to much wider public issues about, politics and funding and structures and traditions and these kind of things. So, all kinds of social issues, social problems can be thought about through this lens. Things like unemployment, obesity, illiteracy, where we put our waste, all this kind of stuff can have like individual effects or effects on particular groups, but they'll be also related to wider social public issues and related to how structures affect who benefits and who doesn't, and how institutions, treat those problems. So to help think through particular problems, such as, say, unemployment, the sociological imagination asks us to think with historical, cultural, structural, and critical points of view. So very broadly, when you want to think of the historical, how has the past come to influence the present? When it comes to the cultural, how does our culture impact on our lives? Structural, which I've talked about a lot already, what role does social organisation play, social structures? And a more generalised version, kind of stepping back from the historical, cultural and structural, is the critical way of thinking. Why is it this way? Who benefits? Who doesn't benefit? What alternatives exist? And really importantly, I think, how can things be better? So let's go into the four factors in a little bit more detail. So in terms of historical factors, the example there is an ad there about asbestos. If you think about what asbestos is like, I think maybe in the late 1800s, early 1900s, a particular science, a particular industry invented this amazing thing to kind of build houses out of. Then, half a century later, it's discovered that it gives you cancer. And then they spend decades trying to cover up that it gave you cancer. In the meantime, people are getting sick, they're dying. Then there's a bunch of legal things that happen. These companies are challenged. They have to make massive payouts to the people that they've, hidden this information from, and it's resulting in people getting sick and dying. There you have a kind of historical analysis, a kind of oversimplified one, of like the problem of asbestos. From a sociological point of view, what that does is kind of allows us to think critically, say, about science and truth. Science produces one version of truth. Here's this thing to make houses out of. Then later it discovers something else. So we can think there, in terms of a critical sociological point of view, how science doesn't really create truth. It creates knowledge, and that changes over time. And so we can see how that plays out today in all kinds of debates about things where increasingly people are suspicious of science, even though it's massively problematic. Often, in terms of some sociological theories resulting from knowledge of these kind of issues that take place. For instance, you read the paper one week and like a glass of red wine's good for you, and the next week it kind of gives you cancer or something. So like knowledge in this sense changes over time, and we have to think historically about that kind of stuff. So in terms of how has the past influenced the present, how do legacies of historical injustice work, how do institutions change over time, and how do they influence people's lives? In particular, when it comes to people that are marginalised and discriminated against, particularly in Indigenous societies that we'll look at in some detail in week 3, what experiences of people's history, how does that come into play in today? And the notion of epigenetics is a particularly interesting way of thinking about that. So historical factors are an important way to kind of understand how things are now, with also the intention of, like, if we can understand how historical forces worked up to how things are now, how we can maybe influence the future and change things for better or for worse. Cultural factors. So we'll look at the notion of culture throughout the course. Culture is often described as one of the hardest words in the English language to define. The way we're using it in this course is essentially culture is the kind of common sense, everyday understandings of the way that we understand how to live, the way that we perform our lives, the things that we see as normal. And these tend to be defined and the result of traditions. Often religious traditions still have huge influence on how we think about things today. So cultural traditions, even if they seem quite old and irrelevant, often have a real influence on our behaviours and interactions today. So cultural factors, for instance, something as simple as like the food we eat. In Australia, we're quite happy to eat, beef, cows. In India, many people in India would see that as abhorrent. But in Australia, we won't eat whales, but like some people in Japan, we're quite happy to eat whales. So the very kind of construction of what's fine to eat, changes very markedly between different cultures, countries, continents, in all kinds of interesting ways. And so we'll be looking at aspects of how that works throughout the course. Cultural beliefs obviously have very real influence on the way people think about the world, think about themselves, and how they treat each other. So this is particularly the case when we try and unpack and critically engage with the very idea of normal, something we'll look at in quite some detail later in the course when we look at the idea of social selves. Values in terms of what's normal and deviant, again, are very different between different cultures sometimes. It's sometimes hard to think of examples, for instance, that wouldn't be seen as good or bad in different situations. So, for instance, killing another human being, for the most part, is seen as a really negative thing. You shouldn't do it. There's laws against it. You're a murderer, or you're manslaughter, or whatever. Even if it happens accidentally, say in a medical situation, there's kind of knock-on effects and punishments for that kind of stuff. But if you're a soldier, it's your job. Cultural specifics, different kind of ways that we live, different definitions of different aspects of the world have profound effects on what's seen as right, wrong, good, bad, moral, immoral, tasteful, vulgar. Again, we'll look at aspects of this throughout the course. Third one is structural factors, which I've kind of gone into a lot in the course already, so I won't go into this too much either, although I did want to have an opportunity here to show my favourite sociological GIF. Structures, schools, laws, politics, bureaucracy, algorithms increasingly. How does the economy shape our life choices? How do the contours of inequality, such as gender, class, race, ethnicity, age, religion, disability, and these things affect life opportunities and experiences? How do these structural factors vary between time and between countries and regions? Very broadly, how do various forms of social organisation and the institutions that are in those societies affect our lives? And broadly, more broadly, here is the critical one, which kind of brings the three together and kind of, I suppose, relates to the various motivations to do research and to try and have some impact in the world. So given all those factors, how could things be otherwise? Would things be better if they were otherwise? If they were otherwise, who would benefit differently and who would maybe be affected more negatively? So sociology is very much interested in this kind of tension between social change and social stasis. So we can think here about what alternative futures are actually possible. And sociological research can provide a starting point for that. One of the photos on the page there is from Mike Davis's amazing book from the 90s called City of Quartz, a very kind of critical take on Los Angeles. And that there is one of the first examples of a form of architecture that's kind of seen to try and discourage people from being in certain places, and that's called the bum-proof bench. A very simple design to try and stop people who are homeless from sleeping in that particular area. Davis pointed out all kinds of other examples that were being used, like turning sprinklers on in parks at night and all this kind of stuff. From a critical point of view, though, you would ask, what kind of society that's so wealthy like ours, where there's the existence of billionaires, still have homeless people? Why do we have a kind of politics and government here that would, invent the bum-proof bench instead of solving homelessness? So these are kind of key critical orientations towards the world. In that sense, in terms of having a critical point of view of the world, a key critical question is what kind of other voices need to be heard in relevant debates about particular social issues. The problem being at the moment is that in terms of who gets a say about how things should be or how things can be fixed, tend to be people of relatively privileged, tend to be wealthy, tend to be white, and often tend to be men. Okay, in terms of summing up, you can see in terms of the kind of vast amount of different things I've kind of covered in the lecture so far is that there's a huge diversity in terms of what sociologists do, the different points of view they come from, the different theoretical traditions they're interested in and use, the different research methods they use, and, different sociologists have different politics. And sociologists debate, like how much we should intervene in the world, whether we should be just kind of a pure science doing our research and allowing people to use it in ways they see fit, or whether we should be actively trying to kind of promote and get our research used to make policy. There's all kinds of debate about this kind of stuff. So while broadly sociology is neither left nor right, I would say that in kind of Australia and the UK in particular, and maybe some countries in Europe, not so much in the US, sociologists have a real concern for social justice and redressing social inequality. So sociology can be more progressive or more conservative in different parts of the world, and that can change over time as well. There's almost nothing I can really think of that has kind of some sociological research on it. Just about anything you can think of will be studied or is being studied by sociologists somewhere in the world. And this is really important because, as I kind of said earlier on, just knowledge about the world is important in and of itself, even if it's not being used to kind of affect policy. So increasingly too, and as we'll really promote throughout the course, that sociology has become a discipline that's increasingly reflexive about itself. We've had a long history in sociology of being dominated by European and American thought, long history of being dominated by men, and there's increasingly efforts to kind of redress this, address some of those biases, and we'll look at that in some detail in week 3. But it's definitely hasn't been fixed. So, for instance, much of the more powerful sociological voices are still in, big European institutions, American universities, the G8 and other universities in Australia. So many of the inequalities that we're going to talk about affecting the wider world are also still quite present in sociology. And there's, again, the kind of tension and debates and efforts to try and address those kind of things. Really importantly, sociology research always involves the use of data and evidence. So we'll look at some theories and concepts throughout the course, and I suppose one way to kind of, for you to, as a new student, to think about the efficacy and legitimacy of those theories is to kind of look at data and evidence from other sociological studies and kind of test them out, I suppose. And we'll be kind of talking about those kind of aspects of that in class throughout the course as well. I've gestured at this already, but like this has been this idea that like, sociologists need to make more of an effort to get out in the real world to affect it. Public discourse, the media and political understandings of things are largely dominated by economics and psychological understandings of the world. That's not necessarily anything wrong with those disciplines per se, but those disciplines tend to also have dominant voices in them that don't really, I suppose, express the variety and interesting critical notion of what's going on in those fields. So the psychological point of view that's dominating in society tends to really reflect individualistic understandings of the world. Economic dominance is very neoliberal and laissez-faire, even though within economics and psychology there's lots of other points of view. So sociologists kind of struggle to get our research and our voices heard, and there's people trying to do it more and more. People in my research centre, for instance, are constantly trying to talk to the media. We've tabled our research in Parliament and made contributions to various policy debates. And so this is, I think, a really important thing for us to increasingly do. You'll also see sociologists intervening and making posts on various social media. Twitter there for a while before it was kind of enshittified was a good version of that. Increasingly sociologists have lost that and are looking for other places to do it. But it's, I think, an important thing for sociologists to be doing, and we should be doing it more. To sum up, okay, so sociology basically challenges those individualistic and biological accounts of social life and human behaviour more generally, focusing on how society influences our lives and how social change can occur. So again, that tension between the way things are and the way things can be. Being a practicing sociologist means considering the relevance of these insights to your own life and adopting a questioning stance to the things you kind of take for granted. Constantly asking how things can be, why things are the way they are now, who benefits from the current arrangements, and what alternatives can exist to make things better for more and more people. So throughout the course, we'll delve into a bunch of different kind of ways of thinking about this. Frankly, we only cover a kind of small percentage of, concepts and theories and traditions. We can only kind of do so much over 12 weeks. What we do try and do in the course is give a wide conceptual kind of offering to allow students to kind of, I suppose, find the conceptual things that they're interested in. But we do ask you to try and not only think about those concepts into relation to your own life, but try and use them to think about how others live and, think maybe as much as you can through the eyes of other people as well. Okay, I'll leave it there. That's the end of week 1. Thanks.